and welcome to our lecture series. This is very exciting, and we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement and a blessing, and I'm going to call up Johnny Sartucci. Thank you very much.
Kile, we always name Johnny. Nata Waksachi, Nata Lokochus Waksachi. I welcome you all here today. My name is Johnny, and I'm Waksachi. I'm a proud Waksachi. I'm honored to be here today to share with you guys a blessing. I'm honored to be here today to see that many people do care about the lands that are important to the people. Not only our people, all the people. And today, I ask the Creator to watch over us today, to grant us wisdom, to guide us, to allow us to help one another, to listen to one another in a good way. And when I say in a good way it's from our hearts. Not good for the little group, but good for everybody. So today, I would like to thank you all again, and on behalf of all the Native Americans here in the Central Valley, I give you thanks, and again, appreciate your help and helping us to preserve those things that are good for everybody. All motivations.
Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to the first talk in the lecture series on Tulare Lake called Pa'ashi by the Tachiokas people. My name is Barbara Breidolf, and I am the president of the Alta Peak chapter of CNPS, which is the California Native Plant Society. And that chapter is located right here in Tulare County. There's some information out front if you're interested, and then there is a little handout that have the dates and the names of the rest of the speakers in the series out on the table out front if you're interested. This series is being co-sponsored by my organization and by COS Cultural Historic Awareness Program, or CHAP. These talks will be recorded and available later on the COS YouTube channel. We live in unsettled times. Fires, drought, floods, groundwater overdraft, wells going dry, undrinkable water, land subsidence, and the conflict and anxiety that surrounds SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and its implementation. Now is the time to review our past actions and current approach to see if there is a better way forward. In order to do that, it is essential that we know the past. We need to know what was here before we re-engineered the land and took away the lake. We need to understand how that happened, and we need to know about the injustices perpetrated on the Native peoples before we can make informed decisions about what we do going forward. That is the purpose of this series. The series is organized as follows. The before, Rob Hansen and Robert Jeff, the Tachi Vice Chair. Rob's going to talk about the biology of Tulare Lake. Robert Jeff will share the Native perspective of Pa'ashi and what it means to his people. So he's the next speaker. Then the alteration and the now will be Mark Arax and Vivian Underhill. Mark Arax will talk about how a lake was converted into farmland and private property. Vivian Underhill will explore how forgetting what happened served to perpetuate an injustice. And going forward, River Partners President Julie Rentner, who's going to talk about how challenge could be turned into opportunity. I encourage you to attend as many of these as you can. I will. So, on to Rob. About 25 years ago, before Rob and I ever met, my husband and I attended a talk here at COS, given by Rob. I was born and raised in Southern California, but I had never heard of Tulare Lake. It was long gone before I was born. Rob's talk about Tulare Lake was a revelation. I didn't know about the Pacific Flyway and the millions of birds that depended on the lake, or how very different it is now from what it was. You folks tonight know about Tulare Lake because of the flooding we have here, if you didn't know about it before, but you probably don't know the original landscape and the richness that it held. That is what I want Rob to share with you tonight. Rob was biology and ecology professor at COS for 35 years. He also has his own biological consulting company that he has run even longer than that. And I actually worked with Rob doing bird work in the valley floor. Almost all of his work has been in the San Joaquin Valley, and he is the go-to for all things biological in our area, in case you didn't know that, Rob. He continues to work here, even though he now lives in Chicago and helps to care for his young grandchildren. So a few practical points. There's going to be a question period after Rob finishes his talk. We're going to hand out cards and ask people to write the questions down and then pass them to the audience. Okay, and I think Marla's going to be in charge of that. I hope she is. That's Marla over there. She's my partner, by the way. She's the CHAP coordinator for COS. Marla, say it again.
Proc now.
Proc now. Okay, so there's that, and then could you remember to put your cell phones on silent so that we don't have interruptions during the talk? And I'm going to do that right now. Thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased to see you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm humbled and I'm excited. It's a kind of a reunion for me, a homecoming, because I am among my College of the Sequoias family. That's how my wife, Deborah, who is just so you know, my priorities, she is my main passion. This is just a title of PowerPoint. She's with me here tonight. She and I both arrived about midnight last night in Chicago. And so I'm back where I taught, like Barbara said, for 35 years. I think a couple of folks in the audience who were my students, but I also see a bunch of new ones. I've got a brother who's driven down with his wife from Fresno today. So I'm overjoyed at the turnout and the phenomenal variety of people from various parts of my past. So it's a really nice honor to be here to be able to share with you what I consider to be my passion that kind of grew from a point like Barbara's of knowing nothing about Tulare Lake. So I hope I'll be able to kind of convey that story. But really what I hope to be able to leave with you tonight is some sense of how the lake got here. You know, that involves some science beyond just looking at a map. So I'll just kind of share how my educational arc about this kind of thing started. I came to California as a high school junior and had my senior year up in Fresno. And when I came here, I was already an ardent bird watcher. It was like, you know, I ate, lived, slept, breathed birds. And my younger brother Keith, who was 5 years younger than I, he was my, young birding buddy. He is now one of the best known bird artists in the United States. So I don't have anything for sale out there, but if you have not seen Birds of the Sierra Nevada by Keith Hansen, it's a great book, and he's a phenomenal artist. We both come from a family our mother was an artist. 3 of my brothers make their living doing art. So you'll hear art pop up frequently in my presentation tonight, because for me, if you surround yourself with wonderful, loving, good friends and artwork and nature, to me, those are the kinds of things that enrich us all and make life wonderful. So when I talked about my arc to get here to Tulare Lake, it started with birds, but then it was like, oh, how come the red-tailed hawk is in an oak tree out on a savanna habitat, and the red-shouldered hawk is in a cottonwood and the riparian habitat, and the Swainson's hawk is in a scrub out on the plains of the west side. So I had to suddenly learn habitats. I had to learn plants, and then it's like, oh gosh, those plants grow where they do because the soils are different. How did that happen? So then it was like, oh, I guess I better take geology. And so then, learning about our planet and its formation, then it was like, oh, maybe astronomy would be good. Maybe meteorology. Maybe I should do a little hydrology, get some engineering in there. So in a sense, the birds led to each of these things that I could have done I would have loved to have had a life with enough time to do a major on each of those, because I love all those topics. So I'll try to weave those in here as they pertain to the topic of the evening. Is my voice making it to the back? When Barbara introduced me, she mentioned the Pacific Flyway. So if you look at a painting that you're seeing on the cover photo of my PowerPoint, it's a piece of artwork by a wonderful artist named Laura Cunningham, and she did a book called A State of Change. The state is California. The change is the change over geological time. She's a trained paleoecologist and an artist. So imagine having the smarts to know that when you were back at a time where the Tachiopots used tules to make the boats that these folks are paddling around out in Tulare Lake. We're looking east toward the Sierra. They're paddling through tule beds. There are snow geese coming down from the winter. That's that Pacific Flyway that Barb was talking about. We already heard a tribal acknowledgement tonight, given far better than anything I could ever pretend to do, by Johnny Sartucci. Johnny built, a little less than 2 years ago, a tule boat, one of the first ones here in the valley in decades, that I had the pleasure of watching him launch it on the Kings River at a celebration for the return of Pa'ashi in October of 2023. You're welcome to read the captions here, but part of what I'm trying to show is that we are in a part of the state without, sort of straight county boundaries of modern time. We're looking at where the various language groups of Native Californians were arrayed on the landscape as best we're able to sort of piece it together today. On this one, you can see where Tulare Lake was located. It's a lake that, for all intents and purposes, has been gone for most of the time since 1898. It looks there a little bit like some funny little critter with 2 little ears sticking out. But it is one named lake of 6 that were present here in the southern part of what most of us call the San Joaquin Valley. When this flyer was printed in the fall of 2023, that's the year that series of atmospheric river storms pummeled the valley. Snowpack, amongst the highest that have ever been recorded, and then runoff coming down the Tule and the Sequoias and Deer Creek and all those channels, creating flooding for poor towns like Allensworth and Alpha and Corcoran and Stratford, all those low-lying towns that are either in the bed of Tulare Lake or right on its historical shoreline. So this event on October 7, that was the first year I ever heard this word. You'll hear several different terms for this part of California. I like to call it Tulare Valley, which sounds kind of odd because there is a Tulare County. There's a city of Tulare. They're both named for a kind of a plant called tule. So I'll try to explain a little bit where some of that came from. Now in this photograph, I'm trying to share with you one of the things that I'm most grateful for in my own life is that I got to know during her lifetime Marie Wilcox, who was the last fluent speaker of Wauchonia language. That's her daughter Jennifer, and Jennifer has a granddaughter who's a student here at COS named Destiny. I wanted to mention that because I think many of us in our education and during our growing up have this kind of sense that the Indians, Native Americans, indigenous people, they had their time and they're gone. No, there are many of them among the audience tonight. Their lifeways are sort of in a renaissance now, I would venture to say, and I want to do everything I can to support that. This was a remarkable woman. She reminded me a lot of my own mom, just, always a really bright, happy smile, supremely intelligent in terms of what she was able to put together to basically put together a dictionary of that language before she passed away a couple of years ago. So these are slides that I might have shown to students if I were doing land acknowledgement to say, we are all here in a place that was once not some county, not some city with an English or Spanish name, but the landscape here originally was the land that, the land and the waters of the people that we see in the bottom right corner here. I just throw this in as a kind of a challenge to the students or to any of you in the audience tonight. Land acknowledgements are all good for helping us remember, whose land we are on and how that has changed. But I'm also, I'm aware that there is a lot of interest in going beyond. And so I'm just putting this up here as kind of a, throw down the gauntlet to students, where if you find yourself informed enough and compelled to do things to help with tribal efforts to basically do what I said at the end, to follow their tribal ecological knowledge to a future that uses the wisdom that served them for 10 to 13,000 years with a lake that they got along with, that did not disappear in less than 50 years like it did when the dominant culture of our time moved into this area. Those are some of the ideas that I'm trying to kind of convey in my presentation tonight. So that's the Thule boat I was talking about. Those are some of the Yokets who were able to get on and paddle around on the day of that event up here on the Kings River in Stratford not too long ago. I find this part of the world to be very beautiful, but I realize that that's kind of an acquired taste, and it's sort of it's a nuanced thing, like, how do you see the beauty there? Well, to me, the beauty is partly because of exactly what, in fact, can I introduce you now, Robert? Because she mentioned you, but if you just stand for a minute. Robert will be giving the second talk in this series on February 13, another Thursday evening, and he knows this land and loves it in a way that I'm just beginning to appreciate. But what I love about it is that there are remnants of it. It's almost like we're sort of, paddling around in a big giant Noah's Ark right now. There are tiny little fragments of all those original landscapes in the Tulare Basin that are still here. And when you see them on a large landscape scale, it's pretty easy to see the beauty. Unfortunately, so many of them have been sort of chopped up and cut down into just tiny little remnants that we just don't get to really appreciate that with the little bits that are still here. So here's that art motif popping in again. Just down the street from where my wife and I live in Chicago is the Chicago Art Institute. And one of Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings is there. And to me, when I just walk down the stairs seeing this at the top of the art gallery, it's like I'm looking at that photograph that I just showed you of the Tulare Valley. It kind of looks like the same place. And so I just shared that writers and artists and musicians and poets, these are some of the people that can help us to appreciate this place that we all share and live in. So here's my syllabus for the night. Here's my lecture note introduction. This is what I'm hoping to do. Kind of explain what the Tulare Lake Basin is. I call it the Tulare Valley. I'll explain why. And to me, there's a process that we go through when we learn. It starts with understanding, where you sort of take in information. It moves to appreciation, where now that you've begun to sort of think about some of those things, it can give you a new way of a new way of thinking about that subject, and hopefully then taking it to a point of love where you can then share that with others. So that's sort of my objective tonight. I'll briefly talk about the climate of the Tulare Valley, our local hydrology. That's something where if you are a farmer, if you're involved in agriculture, I'm sure all of you know that we are, like Barbara said, we're going through a tumultuous time because of sustainable groundwater management, something that is affecting and will affect all of us. My wife's father was an almond and a grape grower up in Madera County, and I know that when he was still alive, his farming operation was beginning to have serious impacts from changes in the groundwater. He had to re-drill a well, $250,000. And he recognized at that time that, he had a conversation with me one day when we drove on our annual tour of the orchards, and he said, we have a job as farmers to somehow educate LA that even though agriculture only generates this percentage of our state income, how do we then convince them to let us keep using this much of the state's water for food that they're eating? We need to somehow make that message sort of sink in, that food and that farm production is still fair and equitable within the sort of the water balance in California. I'll quickly go through geological timeline. Item 5, where I said Paashi and the other five named lakes. If you don't know what they are, I'll list them and show you where they were or are. And then a mosaic of natural communities. That's the part I love. I love going to a grassland to look at a San Joaquin silver puffs. You might think it's the most boring looking grass you've ever heard of. Or to go to a saltbush desert and see you know, these phenomenal spring wildflowers growing in that desert. So those are some of the kinds of things that I'll try to wrap up with in item 6, and then a quick summary of what happened to Tulare Lake in 2023. So in this diagram, almost everybody who's in the valley knows, whoops, I'm not seeing that laser. Does anybody see a light? Don't worry about it. You guys know where the valley is, but when I get on phone calls and I'm making a reservation in LA and I say I'm from Tulare, or I say, oh, it's where's that? You know, I mean, it's sort of like I said at the bottom, we're in the other California. And almost everybody who's here knows there's a Sacramento Valley because that's where the city is. That river flows south to the Delta and exits into the San Francisco Bay. San Joaquin River is right here. And so notice, with Fresno being right here, guess where Fresno is? Fresno is in the Tulare Basin. Fresno is not technically hydrologically, is not in the San Joaquin Valley, but everything from the San Joaquin River north to the Delta, where the San Joaquin River and all those feeder streams north of there, that's the true San Joaquin Valley. So why do I use that term? Here's a little more information on that. I'm talking basically today about everything from Fresno to Bakersfield and the bottom of the Grapevine, from Porterville over to Coalinga. You know, all those cities that are parts of Fresno, Kings, Tulare, and Kern counties, those are the counties that make up the Tulare Basin. Tulare Lake is here. They actually have a barely visible dotted outline there. It's in modern-day Kings County, but before Kings County became Kings County, it was part of it was part of Tulare County. How did Tulare County get its name? From Tulare Lake, because when the county was settled, that was the main natural feature down here on the floor of the valley. Everybody who lived around here knew about it. Many of them had never been there because they were farming out under the oaks around, Visalia, or in the prairie down near Porterville, and so on. But here, finally, if you look where the white arrow is pointing, this is a map from 1875 that names the Sacramento Valley, it names the San Joaquin Valley, and it names the Tulare Valley. And if you look up correspondence that's in some of our state museums that come from that time, when people would write back to their families in Indiana or Georgia or wherever, they would name the Tulare Valley as the place where they lived because there was a huge lake here. Now, this lake is a little bit fanciful. It's kind of an oblong blob, not shaped very accurately, and somebody sort of just, reached into their bag and threw a bunch of popcorn islands in there. There were never that many islands in the lake, but I'll mention a couple of those that we know about that are, historically well documented. So this is where that name comes from that you'll often hear me describe. To me, the valley is sort of shaped like, looks like a big wooden stirring spoon or something like that. But notice something down here. Tulare Valley has Tulare Lake in it, Buena Vista Lake, Kern Lake, Goose Lake. There was another tiny one here. When Tulare Lake would shrink, it would sort of split apart from Tachi, the main part of Tulare Lake, and Tontachi, this sort of separate one here. And then right up near Lemoore Naval Air Station, the lake bed of Summit Lake, the tiniest of all those lakes and the most northerly, all of those are here in the Tulare Valley. There were no named lakes in the San Joaquin Valley or the Sacramento Valley. So there's the curving San Joaquin, southwest out of the Sierra, headed up toward the San Francisco Bay, toward the Delta, and Tulare Lake down here with a couple of the other lakes named here in the south end. But look at that number. Think about that a minute, 13,000 years. There were people living here, and I suspect Robert probably will help us understand this better when he gives his talk in February, but I suspect the first people here probably didn't call themselves Yokas. They probably were from an earlier culture that was more like Asia because they crossed over into North America as far as we can tell from Asia. You're now looking at tules. Most of you grew up knowing terms like tule fog. I'm going to go hang out in the tules. It is a plant, also called bulrush. That term goes back to biblical references and so on. But its genus name, scientists have felt like they needed to change it around, so it changed from Scirpus 50 years ago to one now called Scenoplectus, whatever. It's a genus name of a really cool plant. And if you look at it, it doesn't have broad blade-shaped leaves like a cattail. They grow in often the same places. When you go to a wetland where those plants grow, it's called an emergent wetland. It's not a swamp, because a swamp is a place where hardwood trees grow, but an emergent wetland or marsh might be freshwater marsh, it might grow in the delta and be a saltwater marsh. But the tules you're looking at here once covered these broad bands at the delta of the Kings River, the Sequoia, the Tule, the Kern River. Where they entered the lake, they had deltas. I grew up thinking a delta was a place where a river flowed from the mountains out to the ocean. Well, here, for a reason I hope you'll understand shortly, Tulare Lake is a destination for 4 rivers, and their deltas were here. Their waters typically did not reach the sea. But I feel like this place is pretty cool. You know, I could go to work for the Chamber of Commerce and be a real cheerleader for Tulare Lake, because I think all of these things are pretty spectacular, unique, different. You know, we can, you know, it's almost like you could come up with a new wine label like Napa Valley, but this would be the Tulare Valley, you know, some new kind of a way of thinking about it. So this is sort of what I'm hoping to be able to do tonight. And at the part where, you know, I heard from students all the time. I hear from a lot of people that travel through the valley. It's like, get on I-5 and go through here as fast as you can, because this place is ugly. You know, Kettleman Hill's toxic waste dump is here. There's a bunch of prisons. They dump, you know, they dump sewage from LA out in the Tulare Lake bed. Oh, this place is worthless. You know, yeah, we've all heard that, but I want to get here. So that's, you know, sort of my objective. How do we do that? Start with weather. So you probably all know the term a Mediterranean climate. There's a nice quick summary. Cool, wet winters with snow accumulation atop the Sierra, once upon a time, originally, usually, and hot, dry summers. So notice, I'm sure you all know, Sierra is far higher than the Coast Range. That the geology stuff I'll go over in a little bit is just designed to kind of help you appreciate how different those two mountain ranges are, but also where they came from. So, a watershed is defined here, and if this were the watershed of the Kings River, all that means is that every drop of rain and every snowflake that falls within that lighter colored area there is shed down that river to some place called a floodplain. Now, there's John Wesley Powell, if you know the stories, great stories about the Colorado River. You know, he has this great quote. It says, "Watershed is that area of land, a bounded hydrologic system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common water course, and whereas human settled simple logic demanded that they become part of a community." So, if you think about it, Tulare Lake connecting 4 rivers and 3 streams, 3 creeks, is sort of like the hub of a wheel. And you can't really study just the Sequoia River watershed when you're doing a sigma study, groundwater, because that stuff's connected underground. It's connected, you know, from their sort of shared Sierra watersheds. So when you hear people say Tulare Lake Basin, that blue line outlines the basin. Every bit of precipitation that falls within that line, this is the crest of the Sierra, this is the crest of the transverse ranges to Tehachapi, crest of the Coast Range, and that's the San Joaquin River. Everything within there is part of the Tulare Valley, and that's the Tulare Lake Basin. So when you divide up the watersheds of those rivers, it's pretty interesting. Some of you probably know that its name sort of suggests it, but the Kings, even though that yellow blob is not physically as big as the purple one, more precipitation falls on the Kings River watershed, so it is the king of the 4 rivers that feeds Tulare Lake. Kern River is second, Sequoia River is third, the watershed of the Tule is relatively small, and then tiny little Deer Creek. This is Pozo Creek watershed, and there's a little place there, probably pretty proud of itself. That's White River. You know, I mean, that barely ever flows, and when it does, it's usually rainstorm events. But those are the sources of all that water that flows into the Tulare Lake. Here, I'm channeling my mother's sort of art idea here. If I gave each of those a color, and I'm saying that partly because when you talk to farmers, they often say, "Oh, well, that's that water coming down Elk Bayou. That's, you know, that came out of Sequoia River. So when it meets the Tule River, that's differently colored water." It's a great way to describe it because it's like if you could chemically check the isotopes, you know, whatever, it'd probably be a little bit, you know, chemically somehow recognizably different. If you gave them each a color, red, blue, yellow, all the, you know, primary colors, all the secondary colors, and then throw in maybe white or black for the 7th one, all those waters meet in Tulare Lake, and there meet and generate pure white light, that comes from all these colors sort of blended together. At least that's the way I like to think about it. So now we're at the floodplain part. So the floodplain of the Tulare Lake bed. Here we go. There's the red light. I'm starting down here where the Kern River does this crazy thing. It comes south through the Sierra, goes west through Bakersfield, flows across the valley to what was called Kern Lake. And then a few miles from there was Buena Vista Lake. Those waters then head downhill to Goose Lake, then into the Tulare Lake bed. This is also called the bed of the Tachi Lake, and then Summit Lake was right up here where the Kings River came in up to the north. So that's the floodplain, that's the low area, that's where all that water's going. It wasn't all underwater, but water crossed the floodplain, and the size of those permanent lakes changed from time to time depending on what sort of water there was. If you don't know John Austin, if you have never heard him speak, if you have not seen his phenomenal book called Floods and Droughts in the Tulare Lake Basin, if that looks like a disaster, that's a disaster. That's 3 rivers. That's the date 1997 when Tony Caprio took a photograph of that thing destroying the businesses along that part of the river. John is a former park employee. This book, for somebody like me as a grandparent, I could take parts of this and sit with my 7-year-old grandson, and he'd probably be engaged by stories about chickens moving up into trees because the floodwater drove them out of Wood Lake or wherever that was. He documents all of the floods going back to historic time. It's a phenomenal document. To me, I wasn't being silly here. My good friend Greg Collins, who was once the mayor of Visalia, is in here tonight. I think Greg would echo my sentiment and encourage all county supervisors and city planners to read this document to be better informed about what water does here. We have so many times through history where a drought that may have been for years will be followed immediately by one of the worst floods you can imagine. And that's something that John chronicles supremely well in his book. Back to Art again. An instructor here at COS, I didn't notice it, but he might be here. Matthew Rangel did this wonderful piece that shows the watershed and the floodplain of the Kauai River. He did it for another event that was sponsored here at COS back in 2012 called the Kauai Land and Arts Festival. If you've never been inside the new Darling Hotel downtown, go down into their sort of downstairs. They have a conference room there, and there's a really wonderful mural by Matthew in that room that I'll highlight in a bit. Water table. I have found that this is one of the concepts the hardest to understand. What's water doing under our feet? Where is it? A lot of people I've talked to have this sense that it's like there's a giant Carlsbad cavern down there that's filled up like a big fishbowl, not realizing that what we're talking about is that we are standing on 6 miles. Keep going, you're almost to China. 6 miles of sediment that used to be at the top of the Sierra. And between every grain of sand, silt, clay that's down there, if those grains have fallen together in such a way where there's space in between, that's where the water is moving. And it moves from where it starts higher near the Sierra to where it goes out very low near the Tulare Lake bed. Now, I'll say it again probably, but I think this is a really important concept to point out. A lot of people have the sense that when the lake came back in 2023 that meant, oh great, there's going to be all kinds of percolation out there. The water's going to go into the lake bed and soak down and recharge our groundwater. Unfortunately, no. The lake bed, for reasons you'll discover in a little bit, has a clay layer underneath. There's a lot of clay out the surface, various kinds, but the Corcoran clay that's down deep, hundreds of feet, keeps that water in the water that sits in the lake. It stays in the lake. It might as well be in a porcelain bathtub practically. Now, some of you have seen murals like these in Exeter and Lindsay, here in Visalia. I threw this in because the sentiment that I was trying to point out here when you talk about history, unfortunately, I feel like most young people that have grown up in the Valley or anywhere in California, when they study history, this is all they know about what came before settlement. To me, it's like, we should be ashamed of that. That's embarrassing. I mean, yes, this was interesting, but how were the Native people being treated in the missions? You know, where did they get moved forcefully from to, you know, work at these places? So I know I'm being, you know, very opinionated here, but now I'm talking about another kind of history because I gave a talk once. Some of you might have heard of a gentleman up in Madera County named Bill Coate. He was a really interesting educator. He liked doing sort of real life things. So he worked it out up in Madera County that somebody came up with a covered wagon and the students got to, you know, retrace the track of some of the settler families that came into the Central Valley. And when Bill Coate came to a teacher conference and I gave a talk on the natural history of the valley, he came up afterwards and he said, I thought I knew history of our valley, but you know, I never connected it with the plants, the animals, all that kind of stuff. And I feel like that's something that is valuable that many of us, you know, never got to experience in our growing up. This is in Lindsay. They had to go to a parking lot behind a garage, but it's one of a number of murals. If you can see the name down here at the bottom. Oh gosh, I'm going to forget the name. Colleen Van. She did a lot of the murals in Visalia and a number of towns here in the valley. There's a sycamore, you know, the bird landing there, grizzly bear. There's a pronghorn, you know, trouncing around the other side of this little creek here. This might as well be Yokel Creek because that's pretty close to this town of Lindsay. And there's fish in the stream, a bald eagle's down there snatching up something. So this is what, I mentioned this artist earlier, Laura Cunningham. I had the honor of going to Fresno, to the Fresno Art Center and doing a talk, something like the one we're doing today. She got to show and talk about her paintings. And I tried to, you know, help the audience understand a little bit about the Tulare Valley. So you can see now I'm starting the geology part. Imagine this for a minute. I can't even imagine it because I don't know what 150 million of anything is or looks like. But that long ago, the Sierra certainly didn't have that name, but it was far higher. The Sierra, as far as we know, at one time was as high as 20,000 feet, 50% higher than today. Well, what happened to all of that stuff that used to be up there? Well, over geological time, it came down from the Sierra and went into what was then the Pacific Ocean. So my joke here is that Highway 65, it can bring you up through like, you know, Porterville, Strathmore, Lindsay. That's pretty much where you could have had your beach house back then because that's where the ocean was. Now, following that stretch of time, I was trying to emphasize the word here because like I said, as that sediment poured into the ocean, that was marine sediment going into saltwater. And that's where it stayed for a very, very long time. But all the land we see on the Earth's surface is part of a plate, and as those tectonic plates move around, they have interesting collision after views. And so one of the things that began happening is that as the Pacific plate was sliding in a particular way along the North American plate, we began having some of those marine sediments from the Sierra, stuff that literally was Sierra granite under the ocean, now being lifted up to form what eventually became the Coast Range. So in this image, this is from a really cool museum in Bakersfield called the Buena Vista Museum. If you've never been there, it's worth a visit. When you go there, it's talking about how where modern day Bakersfield is, again, you know, wonderful beachfront property. There's a place just above Bakersfield in the foothills called Sharptooth Hill. And you can see that when this happened, the Central Valley wasn't a valley yet, it was a big lagoon. It was just sort of an afterday from the Pacific. And it had dolphins, porpoises, whales, all kinds of different sharks, including some of the ones illustrated here. That's one of their exhibits. That's what the layer of Miocene sediment looks like, where these fossils, like that one, look at that tooth, that's megalodon, literally, the big tooth. And you can see how big a great white shark is compared to megalodon. Those were swimming in the valley. You know, I mean, Jaws seems scary enough to me. That's pretty remarkable, gigantic predator, but there was something even more awesome. Mosasaurs, my paleontology professor at Fresno State discovered a fossil of these over in the Coast Range near Panoche, and this is now mounted on a wall at Fresno State. These guys used to eat whales, and I was like, come on, you know, these crazy predators. And bird watchers of today would just be wowed if they got to see Osteodontornis. There are fossil skeletal bones of this up in that same sediment up there out of Bakersfield. They are connecting geology and chemistry and an environmental disaster here. The birds you see there, there's a fairly normal black-necked stilt chick in the photograph at the top. In the bottom is a highly deformed hatchling. The proper, that's that's the wrong word, an embryo that was removed from an egg. It would never have survived. It has deformed wings, it has deformed feet, its bill is deformed, the eyes are coming right out of the brain is coming out of its eye sockets. There were some born with no brains at all. It's something called the Kesterson syndrome, and it's all due to an element called selenium. So in a chemistry class, when you look at the periodic table and you look at where sulfur is up there, selenium is right below it, and it has the same number of valence electrons in the outer shell. It bonds to other atoms to make proteins, but when those proteins are being formed with selenium instead of sulfur, which is what should be there, you get all these deformed connective tissues and protein and all these horrendous things that happen because we have moved selenium from where it used to be locked up in the soil. Modern day irrigation liberates the selenium molecules from the soil as the water is percolating down. It goes into a drain pipe that goes to the Central Valley drain that was taking selenium up the San Francisco Bay. So where did it come from? Right there's a volcano. As the Pacific plate began being subducted under North American plate, there were magma, dense chambers coming up. If you've seen Morro Rock, you know that that's the, one of the sort of, what did I write here? I use the right word. It's like the volcanic flood, which is part of that volcanic history. The sulfur deposited there is what's causing these problems in modern day farmland in the Central Valley. They had to shut down the Kesterson National Wildlife Refuge. I worked for 10 years. Barbara mentioned the survey work she did with me. I did work for some districts out in the Tulare Lake bed doing bird surveys to try to document this. And fortunately, in my years doing that, every year we had to collect eggs and do these evaluations. I never saw a deformed chick. The districts were being proactive, and they were changing the way the water in their evaporation ponds was managed so that they would minimize or eliminate that kind of deformity, those malformations. I know some of my diagrams look very technical. Take a look at this one for a minute. It's kind of cool. The yellow, if you can sort of ignore the Coast Range for a while, for a very long time, all that yellow marine sediment, that was all into the ocean. It was all coming from the Sierra. It was basically like ground down Sierra under the sea. When plate tectonics occurred and the Coast Range started being lifted, now you can see those marine sediments are trapped in the valley. And the new sediments coming in are now called continental because they're coming from mountains on one side, coming from mountains on the other. They're not going into the ocean anymore. So the sediments we stand on are not marine, but if you go deep enough, like under the Corcoran clay, that's where you'll likely find those kinds of things. So when Dr. Stabler took our classes over to the Coast Range to see his Mosasaur fossil place, I was picking around with my little rock hammer, and there were things like sand dollars and all sorts of wonderful, bivalves, clams of different kinds. I managed to find the tooth of an animal called Desmostylus, one of his molars. So these guys, here now, we're now far enough into modern time. Coast Range has come up maybe 5 million years ago. These guys that look like a big old hippopotamus, but instead of being a plant eater, they were grinding up these hard shell things in these molars and eating, the soft body parts and stuff like sand dollars. Hey, this diagram is important for understanding the Corcoran clay. If you look at that tiny little red square right there called the Long Valley Caldera on the other side of the Sierra, near Mammoth Mountain and near Crowley Lake, when that caldera, when that exploded, that eruption was so powerful, around a little under 1 million years ago, 760,000 years ago, that if you look at the yellow perimeter of the ash fall, all that ash, super fine material, that's what fell on the Sierra 760,000 years ago, on the waters of the Central Valley that long ago. That's some of the material that is now in that layer called the Corcoran clay, which again is hidden underground, but it's the one that keeps the Tulare Lake bed from being an area where percolation occurs. So, Coast Range Sierra, this is Tulare Lake. Here's the Corcoran clay, underground, deposited long ago. And so most of the sediments that are on top of that are sediments that have flowed in from the Coast Range and from the Sierra since then. Because Corcoran is a well-known town in the valley, there is a prehistoric lake named after that town called Corcoran Lake, or Lake Corcoran, sometimes Lake Clyde. You can see here when it was around. It occurred from about 1 million years ago to something like 560,000 years ago. When I talk about the next part of the change in our state, not only do we have the old mountains that have been always the highest and the new ones coming up here, but as the Pacific plate did that funny grinding along the North American plate, there was a strange thing happening down here where along the San Andreas Fault, a bunch of this land did this crazy, almost like it flipped over in geological time, so that we've now got the transverse range being the newest of the mountains surrounding our valley. They are very young, and with their rising, what they did, picture the direction here. If I had a big eyedropper and I put a big blob of water here, because the transverse range has come up here, that water is now going to roll and flow down to the delta. It's going to go to San Francisco Bay and make it to the ocean. Should do that. In a moment, you'll see why it didn't in historic time. Too complicated. So we're looking from the grapevine down to the valley. And if you want to check on your own the geologic history of Southern California, it's a great little video. You know, the animation in there helps you go, oh my God, that's crazy what happened there along the coast, to help lead to the formation of the transverse ranges. Hey, does anybody, can you all recognize this location here? You've probably all gone to Monterey Bay Aquarium. This is Monterey Bay. There's Elkhorn Slough. And look what's out there in the ocean. A gouged out river channel. How come that's there? How come the ocean has like an old river channel? Well, during the ice ages, when so much of the ocean's water was on land, sea level was far lower. And when Corcoran Lake was there, and because of the movement along that fault, there was a time where waters from Corcoran Lake, instead of going out like we're used to, going out of San Francisco Bay through Cortina Strait, it was going through the Salinas River out into the Pacific Ocean. So the Monterey Submarine Canyon, the canyon underwater, was partly due to what was going on in the Tulare Valley, the southern part of the San Joaquin. I just think that's so cool. Now, if you've been to Rancho La Brea and seen saber-toothed cats and all that other cool fossilized critter that are part of the La Brea fauna, there's another fauna called the Irvingtonian fauna. I never heard about it, but if you travel up through Madera County and go to where all they were trying to do is dig a big hole for a landfill, and then oops, bones, ooh, more bones, more bones. You know, prehistoric camels and horses and saber-toothed cat and scimitar cat, mammoths and mastodons. All of these were some of the critters that were living around the shore of Corcoran Lake at that time. So, you know, who knows what crazy, sort of nature adventure scenes were happening there. But Columbian mammoth, this tooth, people unearthed in the valley over near Coalinga. So these kind of critters were here in the valley. And they were in the valley when the first humans got here. Not all of them, but many of these, megafauna, big animals. Imagine going up against one of these guys with, even the best modern, like, crossbow or a spear. I can't even imagine, but, that'll come back in the story a little bit. If you didn't know this already, we are living technically in a desert. Ecologists would say the southern San Joaquin Valley, the Tulare Basin, there's a desert here called the San Joaquin Desert. Mojave Desert, Chihuahuan Desert, Sonoran Desert, that's a named, known desert. And that's a reality that irrigators have known for a very long time. You've got to bring water to grow your crops in a desert. And the true desert habitats of the valley were some of the first ones that were converted when people began settling and doing irrigated agriculture here. To me, this is sort of a cool thing too. When the glaciers covered the Sierra, again, that's all water that used to be out here. That's why they showed the change in the shoreline. Tulare Lake was right about even with the farthest southern extent of those glaciers. And if you look at where that lake bed is there, and you look at the stippled area showing the glaciers atop the Sierra, these three diagrams are ones that I hope you can take a look at and ponder for a moment. First one is meant to show the Sierra with an ice cap on top. Down here it's supposed to be, it says an incipient dam 25,000 years ago. 25,000, now we're getting down to thousands of years, little numbers. Now they show an ice cap melting, and notice what it's doing to the Kings River. It's forming Kings Canyon, and all that granite that was in that canyon is coming out onto the valley, and look what it's doing. It's coming out as a big alluvial fan being deposited out around Kingsburg. When you drive to Fresno next time, if you've never noticed it, don't do it when you're driving, but if you're in the passenger seat, take a look and you'll notice it's like, suddenly, how come suddenly there's all this sort of higher ground around me here? Well, you're on what's called the Tulare Lake Fan Dam. It's an alluvial fan that goes from Kingsburg and Reedley clear across to Helm and Riverside over on the west side of Fresno County. And so when they showed this relic dam, here's a pond here on the Tulare Lake 10,000 years ago, when people were now living here. The Tachi were their culture was here using Tulare Lake, cohabiting with Tulare Lake, getting along with Tulare Lake for thousands of years. And the reason the lake was there, instead of that water going to the delta like good rivers are supposed to do, is because there was this sort of, it was almost like somebody made a belt across the valley. Now that's not the Kings River. If this looks deserty, this is Coalinga area, this is Arroyo Pasajero. And I'll share with you part of my art sort of appreciating Tulare Valley. When I lived at the Creighton Ranch Wildlife Preserve near Corcoran in 1982, I started working there in 1981. My wife Deborah and I got married in 1983, which was a big flood year. And I was asked by John Lind, who used to do a paper in this area called Valley Voice. John said, wow, you're living out next to the Tulare Lake. You should do an article because there's all this flood water. Tell our readers about Tulare Lake. I was like, what do I know? I mean, in high school, I didn't even know where it was. I'd never even heard of it before. And now I was living on its shoreline, so I had to scramble. There was no internet. I couldn't look up. I had to go to the library. And I went to people at the Boswell Company. They had this phenomenal gentleman named, how can I forget, Stan Barnes. And I called Stan at the Boswell Water Office because the Boswell Company owned the wildlife preserve that I lived on. So I called Stan. I said, Stan, help me, can you read my draft? Tell me where I've got errors in here, fix my numbers. And so Stan said, yeah, I'll do that. And then he said, and Rob, because this year is so amazing, let's get together and do a presentation to the Boswell Company and to people from town. So Boswell Company, in one of their big office rooms where they had like seating like this, they invited people in, and Stan and I got to share a talk on. He talked about the water history of the lake, I got to talk about the wildlife. That's when my interest in Tulare Lake really kicked in. And what Stan shared with me, because he shared with me a book called the California Water Atlas, a book with binding, not a paper, not something just on the internet. But he said, take a look up there, take a look at the Kings River fan right there. There's Kings Canyon, there's the canyon out there on the valley floor. But he said, coming from the west side is Arroyo Pasajero, the biggest stream from the entire west side of the valley, the eastern slope of the Coast Range. That one meets the Kings River. It's almost like magic. Those two both laid out all the sediment there, created a dam, but there is a gap in the dam. Keep doing that. Anyway, the gap is right above where the Kings River is coming in. And the gap had a name in Spanish. Early settlers knew it because they, if they were trying to navigate the water from the Tulare Valley up to the San Joaquin, they had to know how to get through a place called San Juan de San Jose. Who's ever heard of it? Where is it? It's kind of near Mendota Wildlife Area. So now we're getting to the people part. I've tried to sort of spin why there was a lake. We have Sierra and an ocean. Coast Range came up, we became a big giant lagoon, eventually got filled with fresh water, eventually that dumped out through the Salinas River, finally then through Carquinez Straits. Coast Range is there, sediment is filling in, eventually the whole valley was filled enough that we've got solid land that we live on and farm on today. At this time, when it was still during the ice ages, there was an ice-free passage between a couple of those giant ice sheets in North America. And some gnarly folks made their way across into North America, and when they did, if you look at the weapons they're holding, they had spears, and they had a pretty cool tool called an atlatl, which was a handle that you could put a shaft on like a short arrow. That allowed them to have the throwing power to put a projectile through the hide of something like a mammoth, or through the hide of an animal like a megatherium, a giant ground sloth. There's actually places in southern part of Kings County on a place called Dudley Ridge, where archaeologists who were digging there at a prehistoric campsite where they were finding carbon from a fire, they found the scapula, the shoulder blade of a ground sloth with tool marks on it. That's crazy. Hunters gnarly enough to shoot a giant ground sloth. It's a big herbivore, but I mean, he could slice through you like Wolverine on TV or something. But these, the native people that were here were now living in regular villages. They had these boats made of tules. Here's a map in 1850, the year that California became a state. And as I said, there was, on this one, they mentioned the word Tachi, spelled with an E. If you look at the spelling for the modern, the community up at the Santa Rosa Rancheria, Tachi Palace with an I at the end. But this is where Alpa is today. Alpa is on a place that is called the Alpa Sand Ridge. So I shared that with you because that was a known island. When the lake was pretty shallow, it was an island. Am I saying that right? Sorry. When the lake was quite full, it was an island. When the water was high enough, there would be water between Root Island, which was also called Atwell's Island for the name of a wealthy guy from Visalia that had a steamboat that came out and brought hogs out here. But there's also a little island there named Pelican Island, because white pelicans were nesting on the lake at that time. So there we can see the Sand Ridge. The sand in the lake bed might have been brought there by a river, fluvial deposits from flowing water. But at times, in prehistoric times when Tulare Lake was lower, the wind's coming down the valley from the northwest. And I asked Kerry Ruiz, formerly from NRCS, I asked him tonight, and he confirmed for me that when you evaluate the size of the sand grains on the Sand Ridge, it's aeolian, it's wind deposited. It's got this really cool arc shape, like a typical sort of desert sand dune. So wind played a role, moving water played a role. That place called Dudley Ridge, that's tectonic. That's from one of the most recent, earthquakes that sort of put a little, it's almost like gravity carpeting, making a little ripple go along. That's kind of Dudley Ridge. And then there's Kettleman Hills. That's where deep rock from down below that was part of the Carboniferous with oil deposits. That stuff is now way at the surface there, close to the surface. Again, just showing the Sand Ridge, a pretty interesting area. These are just historical maps. There are hundreds of maps of the Tulare Lake. Not so many maps of Kern Lake and Buena Vista Lake. But if you look at the water flowing from one to the other, these lakes were pretty much at the same elevation. If a bunch of water came out of the Coast Range into the Buena Vista Lake, it could move east into this one. But normally, Kern River flowed in out of Bakersfield into Kern Lake over to Buena Vista. The area in between, right in here, was called La Paloma, and it was just a real slough full of tules and things like that. That's the Elk Hills in the background. That's Taft, oil country, desert. Here's an island with pelicans on it. You can see all their nests. This was in the late 1800s. That's one of the biggest birds in North America, about a 10-foot wingspread. Look how many. I mean, how much fish must there have been in Buena Vista Lake to sustain these big fish-eating birds? And then later, when Hollywood came along to sustain the duck hunting with Clark Gable and Gerald Longhorn, that's where they would go. A lot of wealthy folks from LA came up to Kern County because that place was still hopping in terms of waterfowl populations during those movie years. There's that old map with too many islands in the south end of the lake. And look at this one. This one has sections of land on it, square miles. Look how much Tulare Lake would change size in a wet year. And that's not very much elevation change. So this is shallow water. That's why when I talk about tule beds, the tules growing along the east shore of the lake, some explorers said they were 15 miles in diameter. Oh my God, how are you going to get to that lake through that stuff? It's like, it's no wonder hardly anybody ever saw it. When you look at early photographs of the valley, there's almost no photographs of Tulare Lake, partly because it's like, they couldn't put their drone up, I guess. The numbers there I took right out of John Austin's book. So to kind of, if you heard people say Tulare Lake was the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi, it's accurate. They're talking this kind of large in aerial extent. How many square miles did it cover? Depth-wise, there was no Tahoe, 32 feet deep, something like that in the center. It was like a big shallow dinner plate, a saucer, really shallow but very broad and very changeable, very dynamic. Now I'm going to use a technical term. Tulare Lake originally was periodically exorheic. Okay? Endorheic lakes are lakes where the water flows in and just stays in the lake. Okay? An exarrheic lake is where a river flows in, keeps the lake wet, and then some of that water leaves at the other end. Tulare Lake was exarrheic, with water leaving the lake more than half the years prior to settlement and irrigated agriculture. Now, I'm sharing that with you because there's a sentiment we often hear when we get into heated discussions with people in the agricultural business where they say, all that water's going up the river, you're wasting water in the ocean. If you remember that we're dealing with a major salt buildup in the Central Valley, well, there's always, even before agriculture, there were salty places in the valley, alkali soil. But when the lake had an ability more than half the years to flow some of its water up to San Francisco Bay, some of those salts that come out of the Sierra would make it to the ocean instead of accumulating here. So in my mind, saying that that water going to the ocean is wasted, there's a number of reasons that, that it wouldn't hurt it. It could be helpful from time to time to be able to kind of sluice that stuff out of here and take those salts somewhere else where they're not harming agriculture. I mentioned a place called Summit Lake. There it is. You can clearly see it. If you go up to the very end of Tulare Lake right here, the north end where the town of Stratford is, coming up that little channel there's a teeny little body of water. If you drive up Grangeville Bypass on the east side of Lemoore Naval Air Station, Summit Lake is still there. Now, when I was a college-age kid and I went up to Mendota Wildlife Area, that's when I was trying to figure out where was this San Jose. So I went with one of my buddies and we walked out to a big tule bed out in the Fresno Slough. That's how shallow it is. And that's why if you've heard people tell this urban myth, oh yeah, there was a time where there used to be steamboats that went from Bakersfield to San Francisco. No, it never happened. There's no ticket schedule. There was no landing in Bakersfield. There was a steamboat that tried to come the other way from Stockton to the Tulare Lake, but it made it to a little place called Burrell up in Fresno County near Riverdale. And it was the biggest flood that had ever happened in the valley's history, 1862. And when the guy that was in control of that steamboat decided to go to bed at night, when he waked up in the morning, the rain had stopped, the water had gone down, his steamboat was now on land that would never be wet again. And for years, the stagecoaches going by the month looking at their paper and they look out and here's a steamboat on the dry land. It was crazy. But Summit Lake is pretty cool because the valley the elevation changes are so subtle that when the water would go north, it would go through that little gap. It was only like 16 feet wide. And when it would go through there, it would make it all the way up to Mendota. Mendota has a place called the Mendota Pool where the San Joaquin River turns and now goes north. So the waters from the Tulare Valley were joining the waters of the San Joaquin. Some years, if we weren't getting storms in the southern Sierra, but the storms were happening in the San Joaquin Valley, the water would come the other way. It would come south through that gap. It's called a sill. It's like on a flood if you're living in Wood Lake in 2023 and Tulare Lake, storms are happening. You've got water coming up your driveway. You're hoping your sill and your door sill is going to keep that water out of your house, or maybe putting out some sandbags. Well, this was the sill where the water would, when it would stay below that sill, it was Tulare Lake. But if it got higher, it'd be like you're sitting in the bathtub and oops, the water just went over the edge. But that's when the water would go north to the San Joaquin. But it could go either direction. And it did that, I don't know what the precise percentage was, but it did it more than half the years historically. So why am I showing this? There was a question in my outline that said, what happened to Tulare Lake? If I took a poll, I bet a lot of you would say, oh yeah, I read about how they pumped Tulare Lake, they drained it. Okay, think about that. You're at the lowest point in the valley. Okay, I'm going to put a hose in here. Where's that drain water going to go? I'm already at the bottom, so no, you can't drain it. What we did, and nobody meant to do this, we probably collectively as a society couldn't have imagined that we could do it, but as we planted crops on the east side of the valley, all that water that was irrigating the oranges in Strathmore and the alfalfa and all the other crops over here, we were using water that used to all go to Tulare Lake. So it's like over here, it's like turning off all these taps for those rivers, the Kings, the Sequoias, the Tule, the Kern. It's no longer making it into the lake, and the lake is beginning to shrink. So it did not dry up by draining, it dried up by diversion. We were diverting water for production agriculture on the east side of the valley. And so you can see, there was a time when the edge of the lake and the Tulare marshes were here, and it shrunk, and it shrunk, and it kept shrinking until, and by this time, settlers knew that that was really fertile ground out there around Corcoran. And so down at Corcoran literally is in Tulare Lake bed. It was shrinking, shrinking, shrinking. It's almost like institutional memory was like, oh yeah, there used to be a lake here, no worries. We're modern, we've got it under control, we can engineer this thing. So, levees were being built, water is now being able to be contained within various reclamation districts. And at one point, in 1888, the lake was so low, there was so little fresh water coming in, with the salinity that was there, it literally in a year's time became a saline lake. The fish died, the red-legged frog population died, the giant garter snakes died, the crayfish, any gill-breathing critter out there, couldn't handle the change in salinity. And so 1888 was like, the lake was no longer a freshwater lake. It has come back, and sometimes when it's come back, it's all fresh water that's filling it. But in its sort of pre-drying stage, that's the time that it went through. By now, we're beginning to figure out ways to control the flow of rivers. Instead of all the Kings River water going into the Tulare Lake, you could put a structure that could allow you to send some of it to the north, so that you could keep flood water out of Tulare Lake. So that's the year I mentioned a couple times. In New York, they mentioned 1898. You can see a fellow with a transit standing there on this cracked, dry lake bed. Now, it's cracked and dry, it's clay, but it's not Corcoran clay. It's one of the various other clays that occur out in that part of the valley. Okay, I made a big jump. You all see, can you imagine habitats on that landscape? When I showed that picture early on of everybody ashamed of the valley, a lot of people have a sense that the valley is flat as a pancake, there's nothing here, and it was all one thing. Oh yeah, the whole valley was a big swamp. No. The whole valley was a big desert. No. The whole valley was all prairie. It was all of those. So if you look at the little key at the bottom, the rivers in dark brown are riparian habitat. That one here, they're separating cottonwood willow forest along rivers like the Tulare from the valley oak riparian woodland up there around Korea Oaks Preserve. And then the sort of butter yellow on both sides of the valley is a grassland, a prairie. And the pumpkin color here, this is that desert area. And one of the authors of that article is in the room with us tonight, Larry Saslaw, helped write an article about the San Joaquin Desert, where they looked at precipitation and soil characteristics to map this out. And it goes quite a ways north. It's not just here in this Tulare Valley. Some of the San Joaquin Desert lands extend up to around Patterson, I believe. But let me go back, because the other habitat that's an important one is this one. That's not a lake, but that's a wetland. That's emergent marshland where the tules grew. I really like this quote. I'm just going to take a moment to read it. Prior to the late 19th century, Tulare Valley surrounding Tulare Lake was a patchwork of habitats running the ecological gamut from alkaline desert to lush riparian forest. The western portions of the Tulare Basin lay in the rain shadow of coastal mountains and were the most arid regions of the valley. Moving further east, alkaline flats gave way to short grasslands. These grasslands in turn transitioned to salt marshes that thrived along the lake's wavering shoreline. Tall grasslands predominated as the land rose from lake to foothills covered in oak parkland. Tendrils of cottonwood willow forest clung to the waterways that cut towards the lake. So part of what I'm trying to convey here, and Laura did a pretty nice job in this painting in her book, is to show that the valley was a mosaic of all different kinds of landscapes. A lot of people in the early days called it the Serengeti of California, because there were huge flocks of pelicans flying around. It looked like they were in some of the lakes in Africa. Huge populations of pond turtles, tule marshes all around from the tule plant. This habitat, I'm just going to do a quick run through of the habitats and some of the critters. This is called iodine bush scrub. Boy, that sounds appealing, huh? Sounds like something you clean your bathtub with. But that shrubland has a really cool plant that's it's a succulent. It's called a halophyte. It can grow in very salty soils. It's sort of a salt-loving plant. And because it's growing in those salt-loving soils, it does a cool thing. Those are not leaves, that's the stem. The photosynthesis happens in these swollen stem tissues, and when those dry every year and fall off, all the salt that they just pulled out of the salty ground goes right back down there again. So if I'm a little weed that likes to grow in good soil, oh, I'm going to grow under this iodine bush. Not happening, because now you're in this super salty forever soil, and they kind of keep it to themselves. Now that's not snow, that's the alkali, that's the chemistry of those soils after evaporation. The salts come to the surface. There's a map of this San Joaquin Desert that I've been describing. It includes the Carrizo Plain over on the other side of the Temblor Range. But it was not a cactus desert per se. There is one species of cactus that grows in a few areas down here in Kern County, the Bakersfield cactus, but it's a desert where the predominant plant is called saltbush. And when I talked earlier about these subtle things that help you appreciate the valley and love these crazy looking places, there's one of them right there, alkali larkspur. It's this gorgeous lavender flower, and there's so many cream cups and poppies and all these brightly colored flowers that sometimes show up in great populations when the desert blooms. Notice where the desert critters, many of them live. They're underground. They're subterranean to escape the extremes of desert. So you see blunt-nosed leopard lizards living in burrows and burrowing owls. They don't usually do their own burrows. They depend on things like San Joaquin antelope squirrel or kangaroo rat or California ground squirrel to dig the burrow, but birds live underground, kit foxes, leopard lizards. They're when you get to see these critters that are desert animals, it kind of reminds you that the desert is not dead. It's full of life that is highly, so highly evolved that this guy can literally live his whole life without ever drinking water. He eats these super dry seeds, but his metabolism can extract water from that. And he's even got a really long nose so that when he's breathing, he's able to retain all of the water vapor from his exhaled breath to keep in his body so he's not losing that to the dry desert air. Just amazing animals. And then you can see where, no, it doesn't show up. This is outside of Lemoore. A bunch of folks in the early days when, we all dressed casually to go outdoors, out enjoying the prairie and the valley. That's the Tulare Valley. That's like the west side. That's around Kettleman Hills. Carrizo Plain, Kettleman Hills can and does look like that in these banner wildflower eaters. And when I talk about Serengeti of California, you can see why the Thule elk that were probably 250,000 of them at their highest, and animals like pronghorn, commonly called antelope. This more of a desert animal, but the pronghorn were so numerous. So picture this, here we are in Visalia. If you can picture getting on Highway 198, turning right at Plaza Park and headed up toward Dinuba and Collar, when you're on that road, you cross a stretch, if you sort of blink, you'll miss it, but there's about a mile stretch where if you look to the right, you look to the left, it's like, there's no farms here, it's wild open prairie. There was a time where an early writer described a day where the pronghorn hunters out there shot 90 pronghorn in a day. And so these guys were numerous. The Thule elk were super abundant. And there's still, if you drive through Tulare, there's a channel that flows through here called Elk Bayou, because that's probably about what it looked like when there were these giant herds of Thule elk out there. So if grassland doesn't capture your fancy, it can be gorgeous, often for kind of a narrow bit of time in the year, but birds like sandhill crane, mountain plover, and burrowing owl, these are the grassland birds. If you haven't been to Pixley National Wildlife Refuge, there are a number of folks in the room tonight from Tulare Kings Audubon. One of their former members and chapter president, a wonderful teacher from Tulare named Barbara Hawkins, she was largely responsible for working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to get a viewing deck where if you go there during the time of year when the sandhill cranes have come down out of Canada and Alaska, and some of them even from Siberia that come across the Bering Strait, there can be 5,000 or more of them in a day. You don't see the Thule elk today because they're not in this part of the valley. But I'll just share with you that the Tule River Indian tribe is considering bringing Thule elk back to a new piece of land that the state just did through repatriation to them called the Hershey Ranch. And can I give you some credit, Barb?
Sure.
Barb Rydolph and her husband Gary live up at River Ridge up near Springville. They were very instrumental in working with the tribe, with a number of funders and conservation groups to make that make that transaction possible, to come up with the money to get an agreeable landowner. And so that land might have Tule out back in Tulare County in your lifetime. The Tule River Indian tribe brought beaver back into that area. And then, surprise to everybody, nothing that was under anybody's plan, there is now the Adachi wolf pack up there, who has unfortunately eaten most of those beavers. They had other ideas about, natural habitat restoration, but, that process will continue. We want to see that sort of thing keep going and expand. Now, if you have never been to a vernal pool or heard what they are, I never heard of this when I was in college. I thought I kind of knew the valley and knew wildlife, but when I moved to the Craig Ranch, these were some of the critters that I was finding out about. Spadefoot toad, fairy shrimp. There's the sort of oak forest that you see at Sequoias Preserve. That's in Laura's book. Wild-stick Tarzan. Okay, you can check the caption, but Sequoias Preserve in the early days, some folks from Hollywood knew that wild grapes grew here, and they knew that when they put the set together for Tarzan and the chimp down in some warehouse in Hollywood, they weren't going to use a rope. That wouldn't look like a real jungle vine. They sent flatbed trucks up to Tulare County and paid local kids like a penny a foot to climb up in the valley oak trees and cut down wild grape, for the early Johnny Weissmuller black and white Tarzan movies. Who knew? That's one of the wonderful murals in Exeter, but here's what I find wonderful. The photograph is from the Handbook of the Yokuts Indians by Frank Ladd. Not trained as a professional ethnographer, he was a school teacher, but to his credit, he was wonderful at doing stories. He always had a bundle of pencils in his hand, and he kept stories about many, many Yokuts people that he met when there were still more Yokuts that were alive for him to interview in the early part of the 1900s. That's one of the photographs from this book. What I love about it is that it makes me feel like something that I have heard from a number of Native people in the valley, and that is that the Yokuts, whether they were in Kern County or clear up in the Delta, they lived across a huge part of California. It's not like they went to war with one another. There was an annual event where Yokuts from up at the Kings River outside right by Pine Flat Dam, they would take their Thule boats all the way down to Tulare Lake. They were going from one village, one community to another, but they traded and they were peaceable. And there was no word in their language for like starvation or famine because there were acorns and there were clams in Tulare Lake and turtles and fish and rabbits and tule and all the richness of the wild things that nature gave them. A person could say they were Stone Age technology. All that means is that the tools they used were from the earth, the stone obsidian and the chert. The obsidian was not present here, so the Yokuts had, they had broad exchange and they had commerce with the Paiutes that came across the Sierra. Imagine carrying a chunk of obsidian in a basket across the Sierra to head up to Robert's land over near Lemoore where they could gather saltgrass. And the Paiutes, even though they were in a desert where saltgrass grows, the saltgrass from Tulare Lake area was among the best ever. And if you've never tasted it before, I encourage you, if you ever, find a friend who's willing to share some with you. It's kind of a treasured commodity. It is a really, really tasty part of being Yokuts. The baskets that they made were considered among the finest in the world in terms of how tightly they were woven. It's hard to picture this cooking with water in a basket. You put the basket in a fire. No, you take stones from the fire, keep them moving in the water in the basket so that you can boil food in that basket. The design from that rattlesnake might have been the thing that was, incorporated in the artwork in that basket, so they were functional, and yet they were a place to keep that beauty. And the California Indigenous Basket Weavers Association, CIBA, CIBA, if you've never seen presentations by people like Jennifer Malone and her granddaughter, it's a remarkable thing to see the materials they use and how that basket making is done. They're out gathering the materials at a place like the Sequoias Preserve. So Sequoia Riverlands Trust, who manages that property, they make that land available because the land trust does not spray herbicides out there. So when the local tribes come to gather white root sedge, they can do it with the certainty that they're not going to be, often what they're doing is holding part of that in their teeth and stripping off the outer layer to get the shiny white inside. They want to make sure they're not exposed to any kind of herbicides and such on there. in the papers, you're going to hear more and more about good fire, cultural burning in California. Nature used to do this accidentally. A lightning strike in a tule bed could burn for miles around Tulare Lake. A lightning fire out near Farmersville could burn all the way to Porterville. But the Yokuts did burning on purpose because they knew that after this burn, that the kinds of plants that would come up afterwards were some of the things that were very valuable to them as foods. There's a group of plants that are called geophytes, earth plants, that have a bulb, lilies, iris, and so on, and many of those are edible rhodeas. So those were plants that often would be sort of restored by fire. I know I've already gone over it, and I've got lots more stuff. I said I would be finished by telling you what happened when Tulare Lake came back last in 2023. So I'm going through all of I have to put this, my dad was a Navy pilot, and this blew me away. That's a photograph of a seaplane that was trying to fly from Honolulu to San Francisco. But in the days before reliable radar, the guys on board were radioing San Francisco, we're low on fuel, we need to land. And we don't know where we are, it's all cloudy down below. And suddenly the clouds parted and they could see water down there, and they said, we're landing. Tulare Lake. And so these guys are bird watchers. That's how bird watchers used to dress. Hats and ties and all that stuff. But the reason I stuck that in there is because when the Navy did that, typical U.S. government, U.S. Navy's going to run this place for a while. They did torpedo practice from these seaplanes out in Tulare Lake. Okay. This, I think, is appropriate to share this month. Any of you ever have a drink at the Tulare Lake bar? So I stuck that one in there because as a high school kid, I had heard about Tulare Lake in this book. 1913, Some Birds of the Fresno District. So in a couple places in here, John Tyler said, there's a place south of Fresno called Tulare Lake. What's that? So I got on a AAA map, opened it up, a map. Who uses those? Before GPS. And look what it said. Tulare Lake bed, it's a rectangle, dry. And I went driving with my brother. We were going to do some good bird watching at Tulare Lake. That was no good. We found the Tulare Lake bar at Kansas and 10 out on the way to the railroad line south of Hansen. We never found it. So it wasn't until I worked for Nature Conservancy at the Creighton Ranch, the year my wife and I got married. That's our double white mobile home out there on the wildlife preserve. So, that's what that place looked like when we moved there. And it was a really fun time to share with Audubon and tourists that would come. And part of my job was to do outreach. And so that looks like that Laura Cunningham painting. Where's the guy in his Thule boat right there in the Sierra in the background? That's what the view looked like out my trailer window looking to the east. And so groups would come down from San Francisco, up from LA, and my job was to take them on a tour that would go to the, at that time, brand new. Same year we got married was the year the Sequoias Preserve was dedicated in 1983. Tulare Lake came back that year. I also managed the Pixley Vernal Pools Preserve and a place called the Payne Preserve down in Kern County. So I was getting experience visiting grasslands and forests and deserts and vernal pools. I had some responsibility around the Carrizo Plain, where during my tenure there, they released pronghorn for the first time in like 50 years. And those animals now are resident and expanding to the point where they probably are permanent there. So when Deborah and I lived there, that's our little place. There was the water. That's the Tule River. That's 1983. And so we had a canoe that we kept right by our porch because we had no idea. The lake had not done this since 1969. It was another one of those heavy snow years. And so the Boswell Company had to cut a bunch of levees to let floodwater go everywhere. And can't say I was walking on water, but that's Dairy Avenue on the west side of Corcoran. And that's back when I did a lot of different consulting work, including like nighttime kit box spotlighting, paddling out the nesting islands with birds. And I had the good fortune to spend the day with Huell Hauser. He came up, one of his episodes was called Things That Come Back. So in 1997, Tulare Lake came back, and the Kings County Sheriff's Department told me that I couldn't do what he wanted to do. He wanted to get his cameraman in a canoe with me and with Huell in the bow, and we were going to interview while we paddled around out there on the lake. Well, the sheriff's department said, it's private property, you know, we're concerned about liability, you might hit a riser from like a, you know, an irrigation control valve and put a hole in your boat and sink and drown. So we didn't get to do that, we had to just put on waders and walk out in the water, but it was a pretty fun day. And that's just to show, if you can see right about where my belt line is, there is a high water mark. That's how much water was in Tulare Lake that year. You know, I had to go way up the telephone pole to show where that was. Now remember all the colors that were on there originally? Remember me talking about fragments of the valley? That's kind of what we're dealing with today. So like when I take people out to the Herbert Preserve, you know, that's right. Oops. It's a tiny little polygon between Tulare, not working, but it's just east of Tulare. It looks like the letter L. That's 700 acres. So in my lifetime, one of the things that I'm most proud of is that I was able to help, like Barbara and Gary did, I was able to help pull together some funds from Fish and Wildlife Service and the Packard Foundation. We needed to get $1,400,000 to buy this place called the Herbert Preserve. Well, that's a different story, but this is what happened to Tulare Lake in 2023. Started getting wet, got wetter, continued filling up with floodwater. If you've never heard of these places down here, that's called the South Flood Area. Those are larger in surface than the lake up above Success Reservoir outside of Porterville. They're bigger in surface area than the Sequoias Reservoir. They're very broad, but very shallow, but they can hold over 100,000 acre feet of water. So when flood waters come, the agriculturists in the Tulare Basin pump water from a canal. They lift it up and they put it in these reservoirs because that keeps it off the lake bed, which is the shallow stuff up to the north there. That's the productive agricultural ground. But a lot of that ground went underwater and stayed wet for a pretty long time. That water's all gone. It was pumped out, some of it evaporated, very little percolation. That's all, you know, lake bed soils. But that's an aerial shot in 2023 showing Tulare Lake. That's supposed to be me. One of the women that did an article a couple of years ago was talking about how as the Corcoran community was worried about flooding, they were having to raise the reservoir that protected the town and also protected Corcoran State Prison. So if you didn't see this article, imagine that for a minute. What if State Department of Corrections had to go in there and suddenly find, yeah, you want to take a couple of visitors into your home for a while? We need to empty our prison out. I mean, that flood was right at the door of Corcoran Prison. It's a pretty interesting little story. So I will finish with this image that was in some of the publicity we sent out. My old brother Doug used to be an artist for the Fresno Bee. Years ago, I asked him to kind of think through with me to figure out a way to convey past, present, and future. You know, what was the Tulare Valley like originally when it was all wild, when the Tachioka lived here in harmony with the lake and the wildlife? What is it like now, and what could it be like if we begin to apply some of the ways of living with and coexisting with the land that the Tachi use? You know, maybe instead of having just a concrete barrier to a ditch, there could be cottonwood trees growing in a field where, you know, birds feed from time to time, places for wildlife to go under the road. Little things that we can do about how we use water, about how we design land that could allow for, you know, for more beauty, more art in our lives. So the very last shot I'm going to show there's Jennifer Malone again, talking about some of her presentations, her granddaughter Destiny, who I get to meet, I'm hoping to meet soon. So I hope I did what I said I was going to do, kind of explain, you know, my journey to why I think this place is remarkable. I just feel like we're at this amazing place and time right now where we know this stuff from the past, or maybe you didn't, but if you feel like you do now, that with that kind of information, if you appreciate that sort of thing and want to see these places, there are remarkable destinations that any of us can visit in the valley, and that, you know, if we value and treasure those, we can do things as a community, working with advice and help to try and follow the, you know, the desires of the indigenous communities, the tribal groups. I just think there's a lot of good that we are at the beginning of starting to do now, and that's kind of my hope. So if you are interested in hearing a very, you know, not very different, but a different perspective on this from Robert when he comes in February, his presentation. I have the honor of being able to come back to introduce him for that one, and I'm so looking forward to hearing what he has to share. I've only known him a little bit over a year now, but the times we've spent together in the field, I'm just looking forward to all of our interactions going forward, and I appreciate all of your kind attention tonight. I know I went long. Thanks very much. A few of you did take the opportunity to put some questions together, so I'll do the best I can. The first one I see says, has subsidence had a significant effect on the hydrology within the southern Central Valley? Okay, I was going to bring a map tonight to help answer that question. It was printed in 1934. It was done by an engineer, and it has 1 foot contour intervals for the whole Tulare Lake. It's a remarkable document. The lines on that map mean almost nothing today. What the landowners and the growers in the lake bed discovered when the lake came back in 2023, it did not behave the way it did in the flood of '83 that my wife Deborah and I lived through. It's like the water that used to go this way was now going over here. The place that used to be the deep area, now the deep area is over here. How did that happen? We have taken too much water out from underground faster than nature puts it back. And when you do that, all those little pore spaces between the soil particles collapse. And so instead of being, sort of like this, and having little spaces in between, they flatten out together, and now there's nowhere for the water to move. And so once you pull that water out of there, the only thing for this stuff to do is to collapse back into those empty spaces, and so the ground subsides. The Tulare Lake bed is the ground zero of the worst subsidence that's going on in the state. It's sometimes, the first numbers I heard said 8 to 12 inches a year, but now I'm hearing in some places where it's that much a month. And so, it is changing tremendously, and it affects infrastructure. There's a place out there, I didn't share this in the video, but if you go onto YouTube and you look up a fellow named Christopher Beaver, he's a videographer. And I just shared with some of you earlier that he's got 4 videos, one about groundwater called The Water Under Our Feet. And in there, I took Chris out to a spot where I showed him a canal that was about 20 miles long. And it used to be a canal that was engineered so exquisitely, they plumbed it so that if you put water at the south end, you could make that water go all the way up to the town of Corcoran. If Corcoran was where the water supply was, coming in from a reservoir, they could put the water there and move it to the south end. Well now, partway down, because of the ground right here has sunk, that canal has done this in the middle. The canal has sunk, and now the water gets to that canal, gets to that low pot, and it can't go any further. They had to literally put a series of huge lift pumps that are all run on diesel, burning carbon fuel. And now they're having to spend money to send it where it used to be able to go by gravity. And when I say they, I'm talking about Boswell and all the other growers in the lake bed. Now when I say that name Boswell, for me, there's a lot of history there because I worked with that company. They did some amazing habitat things on the wildlife preserve. When we did our prescribed burn, they would loan us a big, giant tractor. Imagine me driving a tractor with big water tanks going up a canal. And so, they were very supportive. Jim Boswell at that time donated $1 million to the Nature Conservancy because, it was one of those things. He knew the president of the Nature Conservancy. They used to go hike in the Himalayas. Boswell was an outdoorsman. He loved hunting. Boswell Company has land here in Tulare County called the Boston Ranch, Yokel Valley. It's a ranch. When Jim Boswell started at that company, he was a cattle guy, and he lost a finger because the rope got around the saddle horn and tore his finger off. He was a very interesting fellow. He knew a lot of the people in his corporation, and they did some really positive things there on the wildlife preserve when I was there. It's no longer a Nature Conservancy preserve. At a certain point, Nature Conservancy and Boswell Company parted ways. It's still owned by the Boswell Company. It's still called Crick Ranch. It still has the sign at the gate, but it's now a part of their operation, and they use reservoirs there for irrigation. Boswell Company has a lot of pumps. Everybody out there pumps groundwater, and because that's been done too fast, yes, there's been a significant impact from subsidence. Second question asked, are you able to share this PowerPoint so I can read it in more detail? That camera, just put us on COS's YouTube page. Any of you can look at this anytime. And Robert's talk will be recorded, so will one from Mark Araf's, author of Dreadland and other wonderful books. Just one aside to share here. When I sat down once, Mark had talked about me in his book called King of California because I had done some work for the Boswell Company. And in there, he kind of portrayed me as Boswell's boy. He's looking the other way because they killed a bunch of fish and a bunch of birds, and Hansen, just kind of rode off with it. He didn't really understand the biology of the thing. I think his journalistic sort of trajectory was such that he sort of saw a story there and built it without really understanding all the details. We still know one another. He understands the sort of full nature of that story at this point. And he, if you haven't read his stuff, he's got a good handle on water in California, agriculture in the Central Valley. Last question says...
Well, two more.
Oh, when did the glacier split Morro Rock from Half Dome? Yosemite, oh my word. That's like way out of my... Eric Hetherington?
What was the question?
It says, when did the glacier split Morro Rock from Half Dome? One is in Sequoia, one is in Yosemite. I think what it means is when did glaciers do any of that glacial carving?
Yeah, I mean they're both granitic.
Yeah.
Granitic rock.
Yeah.
They were never connected in one rock. That's it's just
right. Yeah, they're far apart from one another
and eroding away.
Right.
Similarly.
But the ice ages stretch roughly when, Eric, from to.
The last glacial maximum is like 15,000
yeah.
years ago.
Can you guys hear that? The last glacial maximum, the Wisconsin glacial period, 15,000 years ago. That's when people were now in the valley. When those glaciers were going away and all that water was coming down. What a crazy time that was been. But I know there were glaciers, there were ice ages, so it goes back a long ways. I don't remember what the early numbers were, but.
Yeah. Sort of 2.5, 2.8.
Which one's the one now? Okay, got two more. This one says, how important was the tule plant to the place? Well, it's important in the habitat because all kinds of birds nest in tules. The yokuts, there's a part of the plant that's edible. The shoots that are down in the water are very soft. I've never eaten them. I'd love to hear from somebody what they taste like. But they use tules to make clothing that almost look like skirts. Some of the regalia, the things that the yokuts use for ceremony and dances included tule. They slept on mats of tule. Some of the photographs you saw probably showed tule hogans, the homes that were covered in tule. Not teepees. There were no bison in the Central Valley, so they didn't have animal hides like that. They certainly could have made hides from tule elk. The grizzly bears knew there were a lot of tule elk here. The yokuts knew there were a lot of tule elk here. There were dangerous things in the valley, but the tule plant was super important. Food, cover. And to me, imagine this. Tules that grow 15 feet high that are no bigger around than your finger. And they grow for so many years, so dense, packed together, that the yokuts could climb up on top of a bunch of those, almost like sitting like in a seat. And on a windy day when ducks tend to fly really low, because they don't like to be up where the wind's blowing all around, somebody would be standing with a long stick with a noose at the end, and in the tule bed, if the ducks would go by, you could catch the duck by the neck flying. So tules must have been really an impressive plant. Okay, the last question I have here is one that says, I've been told that Sierra's granite doesn't give off salt like coastal range. Okay, Eric can correct me the way I'm describing this. When water flows across the Sierra into the valley, it's the best water in the world. It's melted snow, it's pure water. But every inch of rock that water flows across there's some erosion going on there where the water is picking minerals up out of that granite because it's eroding it into little sand grains and decomposed granite. So some of those minerals in suspension make it to the valley, and they go wherever the water goes. It doesn't take a lot of energy for water to transport that salt. You know, the salt is, when we say that, I'm not talking necessarily about sodium chloride. It might be magnesium chloride or calcium chloride. There's different molecules, but they come from wonderful water flowing over wonderful granite rock. And so, yes, the Sierra is constantly bringing salt down here. With every cup, every gallon, every acre foot of water, salt comes here. And how we deal with it, you know, we are the 21st century version of the, you know, Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent. They had to deal with salt. As salt built up, they had to switch from wheat to barley. I mean, you know, you can only grow certain crops on a really salty soil in the valley. So, yes, we do get salt from the Sierra. Is that sort of on?
Yeah, I think the Coast Range has different rocks of different composition, so there's some differences in the dissolved components coming off of the Coast Range.
Okay, so Coast Range might have more serpentine or stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And the aqueduct brings water. The delta water is saltier than our drains coming.
Exactly. So John's just sharing that the water coming from the Bay Area or from the Delta down the California aqueduct, which gets pumped over the hills to LA, that is saltier than ours. So I think you can imagine that the very best water that we have coming right out of this east side of the Sierra here, you know, folks in LA love to have that water. It's worth more because they don't have to do certain things to treat it as much as they do that aqueduct water. So, you know, water is everything in California. So the last question says, does the east side have damage with too much salt in soil like the west side? Definitely. Owens Lake, Crowley Lake. The desert lakes are saline lakes. And one of the things that happens is if you stop letting, you know, it's like wasting water by rivers going to the ocean. In the desert, if none of the water goes to those desert lakes any longer, then all of that stuff on those lake bottoms is now exposed to the wind. And so now air quality is affected because you're not allowing that wetland to stay there. Some of that is true in the Tulare Lake. If you make a list of all the nasty stuff that was in Tulare Lake 2 years ago, you know, the water flooded turkey ranches, it flooded dairies. There were places where, you know, evaporation basins where the water has some selenium and a lot of salt in it, that irrigation water and you know, lake water, none of those are supposed to touch there. There were a number of contaminants. PG&E had to go out and gather up all kinds of transformers and other things as the lake, you know, right near pumps and power lines. That's going to be, you know, as much as we all want to see Pa'ashi back, there's a lot of careful planning that's going to have to go into, you know, where should that water sit? What can we do to make sure the quality is good? Can fish survive there? All the related questions. We're just sort of at the beginning step, starting to think about some of those kind of things. Larry.
Hey, could you, Rob, just talk about the transition of non-native grass dominance to those beautiful herb lands that were pre-European contact?
I'll do the best I can. What Larry's talking about is when you go to a place like the Herbert Preserve that I was talking about down here near Farmersville, when you see a grassland, my imagination as a high school kid was, oh, that's just, nobody has leveled that, so that must be what it looked like 100 years ago. Probably looked kind of like that, but the species have almost all changed. When my wife and I got to go to Europe a couple years ago, we were in a place where they had horses pulling carts down the street, and they had feed for the horses in these burlap bags. Oh my God, all the seeds that were stuck to those burlap bags helps me to kind of visualize how when the Spanish came to California and they had cattle on their, you know, wooden galleons, and their, you know, the English brought animals as well. There was soil in the ballast of those ships that had seeds from Portugal and from Spain and from Morocco, and, you know, all these Mediterranean grasses snuck into California, and because we have a Mediterranean climate, once they got here, they just took over. It's hard to find places where native grasses grow. And what a grassland was not just a bunch of grass like a lawn or a playground or a cemetery or something. It was grassland with so many kinds of wonderful flowers. You know, what I grew up calling wildflowers are forbs. They have broad leaves, so you might have a nasty one like dandelion, but all the gorgeous things like California poppy and lupin, those are the ones that used to occur in what were called wildflower fields, where the folks all decked out for the day in the field out in Lemoore. That's what they were looking at, was prairie that still looked a little bit like native prairie, with lots and lots of these wonderful native flowers in among the grasses. I'm not sure if that's where you were going there, if that's what your question was kind of looking for.
Just how the non-native grasses so dominate and the sites that what was a beautiful herbland of all these native annuals have now been dominated by what we're mostly used to seeing, which is kind of that yellow grasses.
So the question that Larry's asking, Larry worked for years for Bureau of Land Management. And those kind of issues, how to manage land for natives, is a very difficult thing. But prescribed fire that I mentioned earlier, the proper kind of grazing, using sheep versus cows, cows versus sheep, all those sorts of things are part of the, sort of the equation or the metrics that we need to do to figure out how best to do that. Yes? Oh, I thought I saw a hand up. All righty, I know I need to let you folks go. It's getting late in the evening.
Yeah, I remember.